opinions expressed are the speaker's own and does not represent legal or accounting advice or counsel and should not be seen as such. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only, a conversation. We make no promises or assertions on how this information will impact your business, your personal life, or financial well-being. The information relayed does not imply endorsement or offer opposition to any specific organization, product, or services. My name is Lori Power, and I'm your host. Let's have a conversation. Thanks so much, John, for joining us today. I'm looking forward to getting to know your business and what you do a little bit better. I think just offline, we were saying, as we're going to get into talking about employee ownership trusts, I have a real affiliation for them because I do employee group benefits. But before we get ahead of ourselves, can you start by taking me through a bit of a background on how you get started in your business and really what your business is?
For sure. Thanks, Lori. So our business, and maybe I'll start first on the employee share plan. Camilla Advisory Group, we started our business 5 years ago. We have 3 legs to the business. One is advising on employee share plans and employee ownership trusts, 2 different buckets, but they kind of go together. We call that one part of our business. The second part of our business is we provide fractional chief financial officers to companies. So we have several contractors working for us that go in and help businesses 1-2 days a week to provide some strategic financial leadership. And then we do M&A advisory. Our sweet spot in M&A advisory is if somebody's looking to sell to a strategic buyer, we help them through that process, and there might be widen the swath a little bit in terms of different strategic buyers that may be looking at them. So let's go back to employee share plans, because that's what we want to talk about today is employee ownership trust and employee share plans. So I'm a CPA. Prior to starting Camilla Advisory, I spent a big chunk of my career as a chief financial officer and as a CEO with 3 or 4 different companies. But go back to my days, aging myself, 35 years ago, I articled at Deloitte. And I articled with the wife of the chief financial officer, Marlon Travel. And I remember her talking about employee share plans way back then, and that Marlon Travel had an employee share plan. And I found out years later that when Marlon Travel sold to Thomas Cook in 1993, they had over 800 employees in the business that were owners in the business. And I got to know Rod Marlon quite well. And it actually goes back to PCL days here in Edmonton. PCL is, everybody knows them as employee ownership. And it goes back to 1977 when Bob Stollery actually bought all of the business from the pools together with 25 managers. So he bought 75% and then had 25 managers. So I've been studying employee share plans and I've been passionate for 30 years, started back then, implemented them in businesses I was a senior leader in, but been helping companies the last 5 years implement them. And how we complement lawyers and accountants, tax accountants, is we do a really good job, I believe, in helping their businesses implement them. So we can do the design phase, just like lawyers and tax accountants can, but where we shine is on the implementation. So really helping businesses implement it to their employees to create that culture you want to create, that culture where you have really good retention and can attract good employees too, because they know employee share plans. So I sit on the Canadian Employee Association board. I've been on the board for quite a while. There's some exciting news there where we hired a new CEO recently to promote employee ownership trust. The government just put them in place last year, 2024. The legislation passed in June, retroactive to June 1st. They're in place for 3 years. So this year, 2025, 2026 as well. And we're hoping to get that extended. So our new CEO, a big mandate, is working with whichever government we have in order to get that extension on the employee ownership trust. And the big thing for founders of businesses with employee ownership trust, we were the last sort of G7 country, well, of the G7 countries, to put in any tax incentive for employee share plans. The US and the UK, which the Canadian model is kind of a hybrid between those two, have had legislation in place for years to benefit founders of businesses that want to sell to an employee ownership trust. And the big benefit that the founders can get is a $10 million capital gains exemption, which for the right size business, and when you're selling a business, that can be significant. So that could be a motivating factor. Obviously, a motivating factor as well, Laurie, is to leave a legacy of your business. So most entrepreneurs and founders of business that have grown their business, they've spent hours and hours with their employees. They've have a vested interest in those employees. A lot of those employees have become friends of theirs over the years because they spend so many hours at work. And so to be able to leave that legacy and handing over your business to a group of employees instead of selling to a private equity firm or a strategic buyer, like I talked about in the M&A, could be something that's really satisfying and kind of fill their purpose as far as what they want to do in terms of leaving a legacy. So it is something that we talk to a lot of business owners about, where they're excited about handing over the business. Now, one of the downsides of it is obviously the employees don't have a lot of money, and so the founder has to be willing to be paid for that business over a period of time. So the type of businesses that it's ideal for are businesses that generate a lot of cash, but cash that's consistently generated. So where you're in an industry where you have ups and downs in terms of cash, it might not be ideal because you want to be paid out over time by the employees. If it has a strong balance sheet, the business, some of that cash that may be sitting on the balance sheet could be utilized to be paid out to the owner through the sale to the employees. Or there's a lot of banks that will come in and do some financing on the business, and that money can be used to get out to the owner in a tax efficient way with the $10 million capital gains exemption. We've been talking to a fair number of banks. Bank of Montreal, BMO, is one that supports the Employee Association and really wants to do a lot of financing in this area. Roynat, which is part of Scotiabank, is another one that's shown a strong interest in doing the financing. The other piece that there's some concern about is if you're selling the business, you need to sell 51% of the business, not you can't be 50-50. And that means you're giving up control of the business. But there's some things from a governance perspective that you can set up your board of directors for the company and for the trust, because there's going to be two different entities. One is the employee ownership trust that's going to own the business. The business is still going to exist as a legal corporation. And so there's no requirement for employees to be on the board of the corporation. You, as a founder, you can't have more than a certain percentage, and so you'd have to get a couple independent directors on the board of the company. There is a requirement for the employees to be on the trust board. So through some governance, there's some things that you can do to set up the business correctly. The other area where we've seen a lot of interest is private equity, especially in Canada and the US somewhat as well. But in Canada, we've seen a lot of change in private equity in terms of the old private equity model was you created a fund, and then 7 years later, you wanted to liquidate the fund. A lot of what I call family offices, businesses that, large businesses that have sold and created family offices in order to invest in other businesses, I've seen that it maybe makes a little bit more sense to make an investment in a business. And just, if it's a good business, let's just keep that for a long period of time. And the reason for that is because the money is more their money, where in a private equity model, they're raising money from a bunch of institutions and wealthy individuals. And so we've seen a fair bit of interest from family offices and other quasi institutions about investing in employee ownership trusts for the 49%. They're comfortable with the 51%. So that would help the founders a lot, because now you can take 49% of your business and get that cash and put it into your retirement or whatever you want to do at that point in your life. So that's been interesting. So it's been slow out of the gate getting transactions done. The first transaction was just done in February last month and this year. We've seen a lot of interest, and it's going to be really interesting to see how much more interest that we have over that time. So it should be an interesting 2025 and 2026 when it comes to employee ownership trust.
I've got a lot of questions, and you've answered a number of them at a high level. So I'm going to go back and tell me, really, there is a difference between employee share ownership and an employee ownership trust. So
Right.
before we go into the differences between the two, Maybe, actually, yes, let's start there. Let's start with what is the difference between an employee share ownership and an employee ownership trust? And then I want to go into the particulars of the pros of one versus the pros of the other.
Yeah, so we do a lot of employee share plans. Typically, we do two types of plans. We'll do what's called a restricted share plan. So that's similar to what a lot of public companies do, where the company actually takes their shares from Treasury and gives them to the employees. And typically, they vest over a period of time for 5 years, let's say, and it's done on an annual basis. So that's very common. That's not going to create any cash for the owner. Well, basically, that's going to create a culture of employee ownership and a retention tool. And as you were talking, you do benefits. It's very much another benefit with pensions, RSPs, group benefits, all those type of things. So the restricted share plan. The other type we do is a share purchase plan. And I talked about the PCL example here in Edmonton, and that's very much what they have is where the employees actually dip into their own jeans, get a loan from the company or get a loan from the bank and actually purchase the shares. In a lot of cases from the founder. In PCL's case, the founder isn't around anymore. But I'll give you an example. We had a small industrial company where there was three key managers that wanted to purchase the shares from the founder. That would be considered an employee share plan, where they're going to do it through, in this particular case, we got a bank involved, and the bank actually provided financing to the company, and then the company provided financing to the employees to purchase the shares.
So it's a
And
voluntary situation.
yeah,
The
voluntary.
employees,
Yeah,
the
go ahead.
employees are choosing to come on and purchase those shares, or the owner is giving shares, but it's not blanketed across everybody.
Correct. So you could set it up so that everybody has the option to do it based on if you're there for, seniority, 2 years, 3 years. We believe if you want to create a culture with an employee share plan that's best for the company, don't discriminate against any employees. And so set up a system where there is financing available if the employee chooses. It's not mandatory. If they choose to purchase the shares, as I said, through a company loan or through digging into their own genes, or through some companies even do a payroll reduction. But you're not required to do that. It's something that people set up, and it can be a great succession tool because you can sell your shares as a founder to those employees. Or those shares can come from Treasury if it's a younger company that's growing and the owners aren't looking for liquidity, but still want to get their employees involved. So there's two different models there. One can be succession, one can be a purchase plan just to get employees involved in order to create the culture. So your question is, what's the difference? Well, with a trust, all the employees are beneficiary after minimum 1 year of service with the company. And how you benefit as a beneficiary, there's a formula. And there can be two different formulas. One is an income formula and one is a capital formula, how that's distributed. It's based on your salary or remuneration with the company, or your hours, or your years of service, and or a combination of all three. So you can build a formula how you and you can gross up the salary as well and say 2 times salary, those type of things. So you can build a formula that fits best for your situation. But every employee automatically becomes a beneficiary of the company. And so if you look at the UK model and then you look at the US model, there's a little bit of a difference where in the US, when you leave the company, you still have equity in employee share plans. In the UK model, basically it's the existing employees that have equity, and there really isn't a mechanism when you leave in order to get that equity out. So Canada decided to go with a bit of a hybrid between the two, and that's why there's two formulas, one for income and one for capital. But it's mandatory. If you're an employee of that company, you're automatically become a beneficiary of that trust. And once you have that year of service, that 1 year of service in. And so that's the key difference between the employee share plan and the trust is how it works in terms of the employees and the benefit they get. So there's a lot more flexibility with a traditional employee share plan, and that you can do a lot of different things within it in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, and you can give more to key employees. You're not restricted by that formula of years of service and hours and such. And so that allows you. But the big carrot is the $10 million capital gains exemption. You don't get that with a regular employee share plan. So all things being equal, there's more flexibility with a regular employee share plan than there is a trust. But that the tax incentive is pretty big and make a huge difference.
So aside from that big carrot, okay,
Yeah.
so thinking about this long term, when you are looking at these two options for in the succession planning realm, what criteria do you look for with the business in order to say, okay, well, I think this one is going to be a better fit for you than this one. Now, keeping all things equal, meaning outside of the big carrot that's there until the end of 2026. So what kind of criteria are we looking at if a business is very interested in having employee ownership of some sort? They're choosing to go down this particular road. What will you direct or advise your clients when they're considering either or?
Well, one of the things with the trust is you want to have key management in place that can take over from the founder if it's the founder's desire to retire over a period of time. So having that next level of management that can step up and be the new leaders of the company is really important. Obviously, that's important on the employee share plan, but there's more flexibility on the just a regular share purchase plan. We talked about it, but consistent cash flows where the business is a mature business that doesn't need a lot of growth capital going forward. So that trust model isn't going to work well for a young company that still needs a lot of growth capital. So those are some of the key things that we look at, but it still comes down to that tax incentive. All things being equal, if that tax incentive wouldn't be there, I would probably take our clients towards a regular employee share plan. I just think that the trust um, is, yeah, the trust works well, but the employee share plan, and so there's a reason. There's a couple trusts in Canada that were in place with employees prior, but not a lot. The reason you're going to see them is because of the tax incentive. If that wasn't there, my suggestion would just be go with the employee share plan.
The another drawback, I think, would be if in considering whether an employee share plan versus an employee ownership trust would be if you have turnover of staff. If you have a lot of turnover on your staff, having 100% participation in an employee ownership trust is really not going to serve the purpose, I think, on the succession planning strategy.
Well, I'd actually say the opposite, Lori, that
No,
with
it might promote people to stay, but if they're already having that kind of turnover,
yeah, oh, for
that's
sure. Oh, I understand what you're saying. Maybe I misunderstood what you're saying. Sure. If you're already having the turnover, both programs obviously could promote people to say, but I thought where you were going and what I was going to say the opposite is it's more efficient with a trust if you have a lot of turnover. Where if you have an employee share plan where you have to buy back shares and do all that, it's administrative hassle when employees leave. All the things that you need to do with an employee share plan, either a restricted share plan and or a share purchase plan. But with a trust, it's a lot simpler because there's not a lot you need to do. You don't become a beneficiary anymore, so there's not a lot of paperwork, and administratively, it's a lot simpler with a trust. But I understand where you're going with that. Sure, if you have a business with a lot of turnover, obviously this could help. And it should help in both cases, especially if the business is growing and you're getting a benefit from it as the business continues to grow. And that's one of the things, like I said, with a growing business, the employee share plan is probably a better option than the trust. It is for a lot of mature businesses. One of the things they targeted when the government put it in place where there's a lot of small towns in Canada, right across Canada, that have interesting small manufacturing facilities or or small little, there's lots of towns where you can say the employer sometimes makes up 20, 15% of the town, or even maybe more in some cases. And the business has been around for years. So those type of businesses where there's kind of a community effect, it kind of plays a little bit off of the co-op model. But instead of the members being all members of the co-op, it's the employees that are members of it. So there's a bit of a socialist aspect to the trust, where with the regular employee share plan, it's much more entrepreneurial, that, everyone's equal, and obviously taking into consideration their salary and years of service that they've been there. So for the right business like that, I think it could be absolutely an ideal solution.
And there's a lot of good success stories. We
Oh,
had
sure.
spoken about Friesen's Press. You had mentioned PCL.
Yeah.
WestJet used to be employee owned,
Yeah.
and dare I say, a better company when they were employee owned.
Yeah.
Significantly, you can see it in the employees of these particular companies. There's a real pride. There's a
Yeah.
pride in ownership. There's a pride on where the company is going. And you're right, when you get into those small communities and you have a company that is employee owned, it can bolster that community to be something even more than what they had expected to be, because it is such a substantial part of that, being part of that community.
Yeah, for sure. It's I talk about PCL, and you mentioned a couple, but it's interesting how the construction industry really has moved to employee ownership, because it had to be competitive with PCL. Like, here in Edmonton, there's Clark's, there's Chandros Construction, Ellis Dawn, another large one. Graham is another one in the construction company. Some of our clients that we see that, we've had employee share plans in place for 2, 3 years. It's just amazing, the culture shift when it's done right, and the clients that have been growing in terms of value. So the employees have been seeing the value in the shares that they own increase, that it just changes the culture so much that employees switch from thinking about paychecks and Fridays and when's my raise coming, to how can I generate some more revenue, or how can I look at controlling some costs, because this is part of mine. And so that mindset shift that you see when the employee ownership plans are done right is amazing to see. And it shows up in the engagement surveys that the companies do. But it has to be done right. It can be negative as well, where an employee, especially in the program where you have loans involved, and a business goes through some kind of industry shock that wasn't expecting, and the value of the shares go down, and the shares may be worth less than what the loans are worth. And so it can be negative as well. I've seen those stories as well. Those companies usually recover, but from a culture perspective, during that time period when there's going through an industry shift, or something's happened within the industry, it can affect employees, especially if their name's on the line for the loans. With the restricted share plans, where you're vesting the shares to the employees, it's not as bad. And I can see that with the trust model, that I don't think a downturn is going to affect the employees as much as it's going to affect the owner, and the owner's ability to get his cash out of the business over a period of time, because that's how those are structured. But we've seen a lot of success stories in employee share plans, and I love seeing the stories. It's when I've gone to the U.S. as well to quite a few conferences, and that's my favorite part of going to employee share plan conferences is when an owner gets up there, or maybe even some of the employees get up there as well, and they're on a panel, or they're talking, and just how passionate they are about their business, and passionate they are about their culture. So our employee ownership group is typically we used to have our conferences in May every year. They've been in Edmonton a few times. Last year was in Montreal, but this year they're coming back out to the west, but we're actually moving it to the fall, and it's in Calgary this year at September 10th to 12th at the Palace here at the Fairmont. So if anybody's interested in learning more on employee share plans, you can go to the Employee Association website. I think we're just announcing save the date here right away, so there'll be more information on that. But it's always great going to those and hearing the stories of the companies that have implemented the employee share plans.
I just see it as such a driver of innovation as well. When people feel that they have that ownership side of things, then they feel that they can now participate in that innovation, that they can bring those ideas forward and help move that company into that next level. For employee ownership trust, you do have a criteria list that you say, you know what, a company should have these items before considering an employee ownership trust if that's going to be their solution. Can you share with me that criteria?
Yeah, sure. We talked about some of them, but the one thing we didn't talk about is what's the size of the business? And we like to say, 2 million EBITDA, and it doesn't have to be EBITDA, but earnings. And the reason we say at least 2 million EBITDA is just doing a valuation, a very simple model in terms of putting a 5 multiple on that. It gives you that $10 million enterprise value. And so if the business is too small, obviously there's costs associated with setting up the trust and legal costs and advisor costs. And so it just would be cost prohibitive if the business is too small. So you want at least that $10 million valuation. Now, one of the things, if you haven't used your small business exemption as well, it's stackable. And so that's 1.25 million, depending if you own it with a partner or such. And so that number might even be a little bit higher if you want to utilize that as well. Some of the other things that we talked about already were a business that generates strong cash flow, has a management team in place, capital needs are lower, and so those are some of the key things that you look for to see if it's a good candidate. And you want a good sized number of employees. Um, you could do it with a smaller number, but I would say probably minimum 25 to 50 employees. Anything smaller than 25, but you probably want at least 50. Obviously, it works better if there's, over 100 or 500, or obviously can do it for the larger businesses as well. But that's some of the criteria that would make sense to take a look at the employee ownership trust.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today. I really appreciate it. I feel better informed on what the difference is between the two, because too often we'll come in from an outsider's perspective and we have a tendency to lump these things together and not understand the nuances. And I appreciate you sharing that clarity and making it easy to understand that clarity. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me, Lori. I appreciate it.